Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Naomi Boness. Naomi is a co-managing director at the Stanford Hydrogen Initiative. She's going to be chairing one of the panels at the forthcoming World Hydrogen North America Congress, which is fast approaching us, 15th to 17th of May in Houston. Welcome, Naomi. Thanks a lot for joining.
Thank you for having me.
As I saw from your background, you're by training a geophysicist and have spent over 13 years at Chevron and have a whole litany of sort of roles across alternative fuels. There's a few interesting companies in there that you've advised and sat on the board of in terms of Amatis and a number of others. I recognize sort of maybe the biofuels area and the renewable natural gas. So a plethora of, I guess, experience around alternatives. We've seen massive challenges to the rise or trying to create viable commercial alternatives in this space in terms of decarbonization of I guess, molecules. So a lot there to unpick. So maybe can you give us an introduction around your current thinking and of the current challenges to hydrogen? We've seen a lot happening, obviously, on the policy front with the IRA, and everyone's beating a drum to the US and seeing this sort of rich subsidy environment on the supply side. So there's a lot happening. So yeah, give us your initial sort of overview of what you think some of the key things are at the moment as we sit here and chat today in sort of May 2020 or April 2023.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that I always like to point out when I'm having these conversations, right? It's even if we electrify everything as much as we possibly can with all renewables, right? That only accounts for 40% of the total global energy mix. So that means 60% of the energy we're using is in the form of molecules, like you said, right? So it's incredibly important that we find sustainable, low carbon alternative molecules for that space, right? So we're not in competition with renewables for the electrification piece. This is, a completely different part of the energy mix that needs low carbon solutions. And of course, hydrogen is receiving a lot of attention, and rightfully so. And I, think about hydrogen much in the same way that I think about natural gas, right? So natural gas, 4 out of the 5 atoms of natural gas are hydrogen. And so any application where you could imagine natural gas working, you could think about hydrogen working. So as we think about the broad spectrum of end uses, right? Those are the applications where we're thinking about. And there are a number of challenges. I mean, we've been making hydrogen for hundreds of years. That part we know sort of, how to do it. We might not be able to do it cost effectively yet. But to scale it at the magnitude we're talking about and to utilize it for these new applications, which have previously relied on molecules that have carbon associated with them, it comes with a lot of challenges. So I like to sort of think about it by stepping through the value chain. So if we think about the production side, right? I think in terms of green hydrogen, the biggest issues on the table, there's been a lot of focus on cost, right? The DOE here in the States has this goal of $1 per kilogram in a decade, and they've put these incentives in place like the Inflation Reduction Act in order to help production suppliers meet that target. But I think that there are some other really big issues that we need to talk about. So one is we're right at the beginning of this journey with hydrogen, and we have this opportunity to make sure that we're really thinking about lessons learned and really thinking about, is this truly sustainable? And are we sort of, invoking any unintended consequences?
Yeah.
And on the electrolyzer side, right, I think that means we need to seriously invest in electrolyzers that do not contain a lot of precious metals, particularly iridium, because we know that if the market grows the way that we're expecting it to, right, 5 times the current 100 metric tons a year market, that we will not have enough iridium in order to manufacture those electrolyzers. So that's going to be a bottleneck, right, in our decarbonization process. So investing now, and there are alternative technologies like anion exchange membrane electrolyzers that don't have precious metals in them, I think is really important.
And to be
I think,
to interrupt, to be clear in terms of some of those rival electrolysis platforms, the alkaline platform obviously does have precious metals in it, and iridium is also in some of the other platforms. I mean, not Aeon, but
yeah. So the alkaline don't. So that's like the traditional way. But the problem with alkaline electrolyzers is that they don't ramp up and down very easily. And so for intermittent power that we're hoping to power this with, right, the renewable power, it's not a great fit. They're also really big and bulky and hard to move around, and come with some other issues. So the proton exchange membranes, the PEMs, are what people are mostly looking at for these applications with renewable power input. And those are the ones that have the precious metals because they're in an acidic environment. The anodes have to be coated in precious metals so that they don't corrode. Gotcha. So we're trying to think about, at Stanford, we've got a lot of people in the labs, right, which are trying to think about alternative technologies, right, that are going to help us get down the right path and that are going to scale, right? So currently, I think we have an issue with manufacturing electrolyzers. There's something like 3.5 gigawatts of electrolyzers being produced a year. That is quickly going to become insufficient, right? So we have to think about how we're going to manufacture those as well.
Yeah.
I guess stepping through the chain on with regard to challenges on the distribution side, right now hydrogen is mostly moved around on the back of tube trailers.
Yeah.
That's obviously going to be somewhat challenging, and also there's emissions associated with doing that, right? From the transportation itself.
It quickly becomes potentially more damaging than blue hydrogen, for example. As soon as you start shipping up, green hydrogen around trucks, and
I think figuring out how we're going to move this around and store it, right? So I've been thinking a lot about, underground storage in various different types of reservoirs. Let's move beyond, just the salt caverns that we know work and try and think about, are there other types of reservoirs that we could put the hydrogen? And then, I think it seems pretty clear to me that we need to get pipelines in place, right? And I think figuring out, what those look like and thinking about things like hydrogen leakage, right? So with methane, which is a really good analogy for where we're headed, we have a situation right now, right, where we have these methane emissions, these leaks from the various bits of infrastructure, and hydrogen would also be damaging to the environment, and it has some global warming potential of its own. So let's figure out, as we're putting this infrastructure in, how we're going to ensure that we're not dealing with issues like hydrogen leakage off the bat. And then I think, go ahead.
No, what you're saying in essence is, we're building a hydrogen industry, I guess, in the 2020s in the full glare of climate change because of climate change, and therefore it really needs to be a truly sustainable industry built from its very foundations. I understand.
Yeah, and I think it's sustainable. Let's broaden our perspective a little bit and not just think about the carbon, which is totally important, and that's where the focus has been, because that's the the emergency right now, right? We need to get that under control to avoid catastrophic global warming. But there are other sustainability issues on the table as we build this out, and we have the luxury at the beginning of the process of applying the lessons we've learned and really trying to think this through so that we don't get ourselves into a situation where we're dealing with some other environmental disaster.
Understood.
Yeah.
And I guess, yeah, you were talking, and maybe we've arrived at the midstream in terms of pipelines versus trucking, and in terms of the, obviously hydrogen is tough to move around. It's, volumetric, etc. So the trade-off between decentralized versus centralized, and the approach. What are some of your thoughts also with Aeon electrolyzers? Being potentially more flexible, more decentralized approach. Do you see that? We've seen maybe in other industries, the IT industry flipping from, centralized computing, which was obviously originally mainframes, and then we went to localized with PCs, and then we went back to mainframes, as it were, in terms of sort of the cloud. As technology changed, what are your thoughts with hydrogen? Do you see the value point moving, or do you see there being real value in a more decentralized approach?
I love that analogy, the computing, and I'm going to steal that. That's great. Look, I think that more and more it's clear that it's not a one size fits all. And that's true for hydrogen, but it's true for every other decarbonization strategy that we're looking at, right? It depends strongly on the region that you're considering, the resources that are available in that region, the needs in terms of supply to that region. So there are going to be, I think, situations where centralized makes a lot of sense because of the volumes involved and the resources available in that location. And there's going to be places where distributed makes a lot of sense, right? Where small, dedicated, renewable power sources to provide enough hydrogen for that localized need so that we're not having to move it around. So I think it's going to vary depending on where we are. And I think that both approaches have their pros and cons, and it needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis.
Gotcha. And I guess going down the midstream, we've now arrived at the demand areas, and we've spoken to a number of people, and people talking about transport. So obviously the US specifically, obviously have your truck fleet, and people looking at that, and obviously power to weight ratios of electric drivetrains. And then beyond that, we see obviously mobility, we have shipping, and then coming down the track pretty fast is aviation, and we've obviously got the bio-SAF components, but then potential for e-fuels. So transport is obviously a big source. And what are your thoughts there on transport, and then beyond transport and some of the other areas in terms of sort of early adopters for clean hydrogen?
So I mean, on transport, I think for heavy duty transport, there really aren't a lot of options on the table, and hydrogen makes a lot of sense, right? So for big trucks where the weight and payload capacity of batteries is kind of impinging the economics, hydrogen would make a lot of sense. We're seeing a lot of interest in the marine space, might end up being a derivative like ammonia, for example, or methanol, but I think it'll be hydrogen related there. And then, of course, for aviation, as you mentioned, right, the nice thing about aviation, right, is that we can blend it because there's basically no other alternatives on the table right now, and we don't have to modify the engines in order to blend in sustainable aviation fuels. But I think producing those in the quantities necessary is going to be a tough order to meet. So, I think there's lots of other end use applications that I think, basically, as I said earlier, anywhere that you could imagine using natural gas, you could think about hydrogen, right? So in particular, these hard to abate sectors like steel and cement, I'm very interested in those. We have a really big project at Stanford looking at steel. And I think, one of the things that I think we have to keep in mind is that it's not feasible to replace all of the existing infrastructure facilities for any industry, actually, from scratch. So anything that we can do that utilizes the existing build out is going to be really important. So for steel, for example, right, there's some hydrogen facilities. But I think that if we can figure out a way to utilize hydrogen within an existing blast furnace, it's going to be much more palatable. And these, the economics of using hydrogen really deserve a lot more attention than they're getting right now. So, we got the IRA, which is on the supply side. It's amazing. I mean, the whole world is jealous, right? We're really doing great on the supply side. But in order for industries to adopt the use of hydrogen, right, it's going to be economically challenging without some incentives on the demand side. And I think back to the early days of wind and solar, right? We had targets in place, renewable portfolio standards for the utilities that required them to have a certain percentage of renewables. And I think that we probably need something similar on the hydrogen side if we're going to get the pull from the demand markets that we need.
With that, it's because they're very specific or different usage cases, be it cement or steel, and each one requires its own capital investment. And therefore, you need some sector-specific, regulations to try and pull and scale those specific technology change or investments that need to occur in those silos, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think, going back to transportation, the reason that hydrogen has been adopted in transportation, right, is primarily because of the low carbon fuel standard that we have in California that has created a pull from the markets. And we need that within the other hard to abate sectors as well, right? If we want to experience that same kind of uptake in the markets. So, I think that we have some analogies to draw from, and we know that they work. And I think it would be fairly easy actually to prioritize which sectors we start with in terms of creating policies. But I think you're right that they have to be sector specific.
Excellent. Well, it's been fascinating having a chat with you and getting your viewpoints. Thanks a lot for taking the time out of your busy schedule to do that. And clearly, thanks in advance for taking part in World Hydrogen North America. Congress is going very, very well. There'll probably be a doubling from last year's attendance. So we're looking at sort of 700-800 people, and the list is looking very good with a whole array of people from right across the value chain and all different sectors. And so fascinating area, fascinating time to be involved in hydrogen. And thanks a lot for your support and keep up all the good work at Stanford. So many thanks, Naomi.
Thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you in a few weeks.
Cheers. Take care.
Bye-bye.